Hello chess lovers, let's have a quick look at a game played in round 5 at US Chess Championship 2017. With the white pieces is playing Ray Robson and his opponent is Alexander Shabalov. Robson started with e4 and Shabalov went for modern defense g6, d4, bishop g7, knight c3. In his annotation to a game against Paul Benko, Bobby Fischer suggested the move h4, which looks very interesting. The idea is to play h5 and then h takes g6 and weaken the king side. But instead we see this standard line, knight c3, c6, f4, d5, e5, knight h6, trying to bring the knight to f5 square, knight f3. And if you have a look at this position, it's quite unpleasant to play with the black pieces when you have such a bishop on g7 and your opponent's pawns are placed on dark squares. So black in this position went for f6 in order to break the center. Bishop e3, castling, h3 preventing any bishop g4 or knight g4 moves, queen b6, and an interesting idea by Ray Robson, queen d2. As you can see, the pawn on b2 is hanging. Robson decided to sacrifice the pawn on b2, rook b1, queen a3. And you may ask, where is the compensation? Why did white decided to sacrifice that pawn? Well, the thing is that right now white rook is controlling b file and also putting pressure on this b7 square. It's very problematic for black. How is black going to develop its bishop? For right now, as you can see, the bishop is protecting the pawn on b7, and also this queen on a3 is somehow misplaced. Here comes g4 and white is starting a pawn storm. Knight f7, bishop d3 developing the last piece, f takes e5, d takes e5. Well, it's also quite playable. F takes e5 followed by castling kingside. But we see d takes e5, knight a6, rook b3, queen a5 castling, e6, h4, knight c5, and white is paying no attention that his rook on b3 is hanging and goes for h5, putting pressure on this g6 square. By the way, there is a very interesting line. Instead of playing h5, it's also possible knight takes d5. If knight takes b3, then knight e7 check, king h8, a takes b3, queen takes d2, knight takes d2, bishop d7, bishop takes g6, h takes g6, knight takes g6 check, king g8, knight f8, bishop f8. Well, if you have a look, white has two pawns against black bishop, but according to the engine this is equal, but at some point this may not be enough. So let's go back. Instead we see this aggressive looking h5 move and knight takes d3. The thing is that if you take on b3 with your knight, then after c takes b3 it can be very unpleasant because this bishop is putting too much pressure on this diagonal. We see knight takes d3 getting rid of this attacking bishop, c takes d3, g takes h5 and g5, knight h8, queen h2, knight g6, queen takes h5, knight takes f4, bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, knight e2, rook f8, knight g3, and queen c5 check, king h1, and now comes a dubious move by black, queen e7. The thing is that it's better to play bishop d7, develop its last piece, and the idea is to bring the bishop to g6 square by playing bishop e8 and then bishop g6. But of course in this position white can play g6, after h takes g6, queen g6, and only now queen e7. Well, of course you are giving this pawn on b7, but this line is of course better for black. But instead we see queen e7, And here comes rook b2. White is going to bring in rook to h2 in order to put pressure on h7 square. Queen f7. Black missed a very strong move, queen a3, forking the rook and the pawn on d3. The thing is that you can't play rook h2 in this position because black can simply take on d3 and already the pawn on h7 is protected. Let's go back, but instead we see in this position queen f7, queen h3, b6, rook h2, queen g6, knight h5, and the knight is eyeing on f6 square, bishop a6, knight f6 check, king f7. Well, if you take on f6, then g takes f6 and white is threatening rook g1. If king h8, then rook g1, followed by rook g7. But instead we see in this position king f7. Now comes knight d4 and black resigned because black's position is just collapsing. If, for example, rook e8, then knight takes h7 check, king g8, knight f6 check, king f7, knight takes e8, and this is an easy win for white. If king e8, then rook f6, and that's why, as I have already mentioned, after knight d4, black resigned. A great game by Robson. Your comments please, and thanks for watching. Good luck.